welcome to Vendor Day. I see some folks on the call who have joined some other sessions, and I'm happy that you feel like this has been hopefully a benefit to you. This is really an opportunity for the industry to scan the horizon for innovative solutions for clinical research, both now and what these vendors are planning to bring to the industry in the future. And so while Clario has a presentation planned for you, we strongly encourage you to put questions and comments in the Q&A and share your insights as well. It's helpful for attendees to learn from the vendors and other attendees as well. So we'd like you to share your needs with others on this session today. Please note that this session is being recorded, and we would be happy to connect you with today's presenters who can share it with you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jeff Heilbraun and Bob Kleiman, who will introduce themselves and take it from here. Enjoy the session.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Lisa. Appreciate the introduction and especially appreciate the opportunity to share some present and future activities in the area of cardiac safety. As Lisa noted, my name is Jeff Heilbraun, and I'm a member of the Clario Cardiac Safety Medical and Scientific Affairs team and have been in the industry for some 30 years. And I'm joined today also by my colleague and Chief Medical Officer at Clario, Dr. Robert Kleiman. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us. I'm Bob Kleiman. I'm a cardiac electrophysiologist by background and Chief Medical Officer for Clario, formerly ERT. And thanks for joining us again.
So with that, you can see that the title of this session is focused in the blood pressure monitoring and taking a look at technology and regulatory developments, but we're going to expand beyond that. Clario has many different aspects of our capabilities, but with the request to share some perspective and future trends in the industry, we thought this was a good place to start. So again, as Lisa had shared, we'd really like this to be interactive. Sending specific questions in would be great, but let's move forward just based upon the time. And we did want to share an agenda for today's discussion. The goal of the presentation, again, is to give you some perspective as well as trends in the area in cardiac safety specific to blood pressure monitoring, but also wrap that around and engage it within specific therapeutic areas, recognizing that many of you who are attending today's presentation have very specific interests based upon where you and your organizations are going in the pharmaceutical development arena. With that, we're going to break it down into looking specifically at blood pressure from an endpoint and a regulatory perspective, because we do know that within the arena, our focus has always been in efficacy and safety. But how does that line up with blood pressure? Something which many people are familiar with, but what are the directions that we're going in? Applying those concepts to specific therapeutic indications, looking beyond what people are most familiar with blood pressure, which is more on the efficacy and antihypertensive drug development. And then rounding it out with looking at specific blood pressure modalities. What are the available technologies? How are they being applied? And where is the industry and headed? And how are they going to be implemented? Which wraps very well for those that are interested in decentralized clinical trials as well. That question also comes up together. So with that, let's move forward. And I put up these cartoons because I think that I find them funny. I'm the guy in the middle, in the back there, in that black and white photo. But it kind of shows some progression when we're looking at blood pressure and cardiac safety in clinical trials. If you look, the individual has the stethoscope, as many of us in the industry are familiar, really having been the primary methodology with auscultating using a mercury manometer. But where has the industry gone? And where has technology gone? So we've moved beyond in many cases, not removed, but added on to by implementing new technologies. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, there's a kind of another good cartoon talking about the fact that many technologies, including blood pressure, are getting, modified, modernized, so that they can either be worn in an ambulatory type capability, but as it says, we're looking to get them smaller so that they can be more comfortable for the individual. And finally, if you look at the bottom right, one of the more newer technologies when we're specifically looking at blood pressure, but many technologies going either to either a wristwatch or a patch, and in fact getting a different amount of data, as well as it being measured a little bit differently. And what does that mean to the industry? These are new technologies. How do I apply them both operationally as well as scientifically when looking to reach an endpoint? Now, I'm sharing this slide for a couple of reasons. It's back from 2019. It's out of Nature. What was interesting for me when first doing research on this was, getting an idea of where the focus is on drug development. And you can see that, back then and even still to today, a focus being in the oncology area of new drugs, as well as in infectious disease and neuroscience, and then across a number of different therapeutic areas. Why is this important? This is important to understand for a couple of different reasons within cardiac safety. One, cardiac safety, whether it be ECG, imaging, blood pressure, is actually a component across all therapeutic indications. It is not, of course, specific to any one based upon regulatory requirements. The other piece that's important about this is that it's a juncture for us at Clario. We have the capacity to cardiac safety, imaging, other modalities. And that's important because when we talk about innovations, what is the market looking for? I think in many cases, the market is looking for both the medical and scientific resources, as well as the operational resources to bring a solution together. So that's for us from Clario, an important kind of theme that we focus on. And what we'll do today is take a look at some specific therapeutic areas related to cardiac safety, again, focusing on blood pressure and where have we taken it with the industry and a regulatory science focus. So I'm sharing with you images of members of our team in the cardiac safety group. And why am I doing that? I'm doing it because it's important when we look at the industry overall. It's moving quickly. And the idea is when we talk about innovations and future horizons, is there two components that are critical to this. One is the people that do have the medical and scientific experience to be able to support those developments and integration of new technologies. The other piece, of course, being the operational and what's going to work in a clinical trial environment. You do need to make sure that however you're approaching that endpoint, that it's functional as well as meeting the endpoint. And that's where bringing the resources together from medical and scientific across all of the areas, whether it be cardiac safety, oncology, rheumatology, come together. But that's really why I shared that, not just because it's one of the better pictures I have. So let's take a look at the directions in the industry. And when we talk about blood pressure, we know that the two key components there are efficacy and safety. Nothing too unique in that aspect of it, but definitely it's matured both from an endpoint and from the technologies used. So I'm not going to spend a great deal of time looking at the efficacy point. It is well recognized within the regulatory arena of what the expectations are. But what's interesting to note, as we've seen the efficacy endpoint mature, you've seen it go from the clinic setting, where it was a set of readings that are taken, to the use of ambulatory blood pressure, which is now widely recognized as a extremely gold standard type tool from efficacy, as well as then moving into the safety point. But for this moment, we'll talk about the efficacy endpoint, and even then moving into other technologies, again, to show an antihypertensive effect on reducing the blood pressure in a hypertensive population. Things have continued to mature when we look into the efficacy endpoints, both from the drug developer standpoint with new therapeutic modalities, when we talk about mRNA and other areas, So again, a continued focus on this, also looking across different patient populations such as pediatric and moving into other disease states associated with it. So I won't spend too much time here because I think there's a strong deal of familiarity in that area, but again, always happy to revisit it. What becomes very much a hot topic in the world of cardiac safety and blood pressure, if you hadn't heard of it or were not aware of it, there's actually a draft guidance that was generated by the FDA called the Assessment of the Pressor Effect on Drugs. And again, it is a draft. It's gone through a couple of cycles and revisions, the most recent one coming out in February 2022. And there were some highlights to this as this has matured. So when looking at this, it didn't just happen. Again, as our goal here today is to kind of show the progression and the continued forward progress in things. So way back, even before 2012, there was discussion about looking at the blood pressure response of therapeutic agents that increase the blood pressure. Doesn't mean that they create a hypertensive effect. It means that there is an increase in blood pressure associated with exposure to the compound. And so the question came up, is there a need to do this evaluation and how should it be considered from a regulatory standpoint? And there was no requirement, although it was clearly being evaluated by pharmaceutical companies and by the regulators well before the guidance was presented. And so you can see in the bullet points there that there were certain drug classes that had specific expectations. Again, prior to that, in 2018, the first draft guidance was released and was opened up for public discussion and feedback on 2019, and then going to the most recent release in February 22, and along the way, specific publications coming from the FDA as well. So this is a very interesting area. It's somewhat of uncharted territory as to what the expectations are prior to that. And so things have gotten a little bit clearer, and discussions have been very active by both biopharmaceutical and ourselves with the FDA as to the application of the guidance or draft guidance to the cardiac safety arena. So what you can see here is that it tended to give some advice, as many of the guidances are, and the idea again being that this increase in blood pressure, again, it doesn't have to be a hypertensive response, it's an increase in blood pressure, and the need to define that increase, because we do know that even a small increase or elevation in blood pressure can be related to an increase in stroke, heart attack, and other endpoints. So this was really the key consideration for the draft guidance. So some of the key focus points that you can see here is that the effect of the drug can be important consideration looking at the benefit risk, and this is going back to 2018. It did highlight that there was a difference between a short-term exposure to the drug and a chronic exposure. So am I looking at something from a short cycle, or is this a therapeutic agent that a patient is going to be on for many years? They did emphasize the use of that ambulatory blood pressure that we'll take a look at shortly about the technology if you haven't seen it. And again, it's looking at defining that potential blood pressure response or increase. There are and is a reference to clinic blood pressure specific to looking at the short-term response. And then looking, this was really interesting in that the focus on this is looking at the study population, not so much looking at a healthy volunteer, but when looking to address the Pressor effect, that it should be conducted with an intended therapeutic treatment population. So that takes us forward then to 2022 and the newer release or the updated release on that. The key points that were identified in that, and that it looked at both the systolic and the diastolic. Again, the original one focused only on the systolic. It started to take a look at the clinic BP as being more of an area of interest, not just the ABPM, but an incorporation of the clinic BP as an endpoint for assessment. It talked about taking a look at study designs, whether or not you needed a placebo control group. And probably two of the major bullet points at the bottom are the key take homes. It did reference specific statistical analyses and what it would be to require in the powering to exclude a 3 millimeter increase, again, focused on the ABPM in a 24-hour average systolic blood pressure, giving that statistical reference. And this was probably one of the most informative updates coming from the 2022, and then a good amount of communication related to the labeling implications, which again had not been seen in the 2018, but was seen in the 2022. And again, it is still in a draft guidance, so open for discussion. So again, we can definitely come back and revisit questions to that. There's a lot of expertise that Dr. Kleiman brings to the table on this topic, but I do want to be cognizant of time. So if you do have questions, please share them and we will make sure that we get to them. But I did want to take that next step when we're looking at blood pressure. And as you saw in one of the earlier slides of the development, nothing new to the folks on this phone, oncology continues to be a rapidly and needed expansion in drug development. And so wanted to share some insight on that. And when we talk about oncology and cardiac safety, you come directly to an area that has been a growth area of scientific and medical focus, which has been in what they call cardio-oncology. It didn't really exist before, but it started to take evolution both from a clinical management of patients with cancer and then moving into the clinical trial and clinical drug development arena. And again, there are some similarities to how that's approached, but it became very important to recognize that many of the oncologic agents were clearly doing what they were designed to do, which was to treat the disease. But in fact, many times there was a cardiac safety consideration. Again, looking at benefit risk, the focus is on, of course, understanding and recognizing that it treats the disease, but defining that potential cardiac safety signal associated with it. Doesn't mean that a drug would stop in development in no way, shape, or form. What it means is that there's a responsibility to define that cardiac safety endpoint, which for those on the call right now, for familiarity, we are very familiar, of course, as an industry with the ECG endpoint, looking at the QT and the directives around that, and specifically in the ICH-E14, there is reference to approaching oncology drugs from a cardiac safety perspective. The blood pressure endpoint, which we'll touch on even more, but again, many of the therapeutic agents do lead to an increase in blood pressure, and many of them do have labeling as to how to address that increase in blood pressure when administering the medication. But what do we need to do in the clinical trials arena to support those definitions? And included within that, of course, you have the imaging endpoints of echo and MRI being a key assessment for the safety and issues that could be associated with the cardiac structure. Again, focusing on the risk benefit. So for many of you, this may be very familiar, but it's important to take this as a whole picture when we're looking at individuals and going forward in the evolution of oncology drug development. And to kind of re-emphasize why this becomes important, you can see even coming up from the clinical perspective, 2022, the European Society of Cardiology, focusing on guidelines for cardio-oncology. And again, more of a clinical factor, but directly applying it to the drug development arena and what should we be looking for when doing clinical trials in drug development. And these images are just some of the materials from that publication, but it's clear if you look on the right-hand side, there are many areas of consideration, both from the physical structure and function of the heart to the vascular beds of individuals who are exposed to oncologic agents. And again, to highlight why this is continuing to grow in an area of continued focus, even in this year's American College of Cardiology, there's a very specific division that has been developed, which is for cardio-oncology and looking at cardiovascular care with oncology patients. For me, there's an interesting discussion around managing hypertension in cancer patients and survivors. Again, that was more of a clinical perspective, but directly applies to what we need to look for when we are developing and supporting the development of oncologic agents from a cardiac safety perspective. This is a good example of some early work done by axitinib and the teams at Pfizer. This study is back from the early 2000s, but what's interesting here is you're looking at an ABPM profile. So these are 24-hour profiles. In the clinical trial itself, they had a baseline, which you can see in purple, the systolic on top, the diastolic on the bottom. And then you can see that there was another ABPM completed at day 4 after exposure, and then at day 15. What's important here is that this study did in fact go ahead and define that there was a blood pressure change when exposed to axitinib. And what's interesting about it is that it was consistent. So the increase both for the systolic and diastolic didn't go up based upon continued exposure up to day 15. It stayed pretty much the same. So from a defining of the blood pressure response, the study did what it was intended to do. It was recognized that the class of compound was going to lead to an increase in blood pressure. They've defined that response in this study. They also used home blood pressure as another means of defining the individual's blood pressure, as well as a safety endpoint, so that if an individual had a blood pressure that was above a threshold, it could be managed and reported back to the clinical site. So again, a very interesting way of defining that blood pressure response, and an early adopter of approaching addressing that blood pressure signal in its drug development plan. Another example, when we start to take a look at therapeutic indications, and this is going to be in a similar class of compounds, might be within an area of rheumatology. And in this case, again, a little bit of an older study back in 2014. There are newer ones, of course. But what I liked about this study and what the teams at AstraZeneca had worked on was, again, addressing this potential blood pressure signal in a specific patient population. Again, the previous one looked at, of course, individuals with cancer. This one taking a look at individuals with arthritis. And so what happened to the blood pressure based upon exposure to the medication? This was a phase 2. They had done a 1-year study. They had 2 ABPM points built into their trial design. They also had home BP and clinic BP built into it as well. But again, looking specifically at the ABPM, they had a similar slide of the curves of the blood pressure. But what I thought was interesting, and I apologize that I didn't highlight this, but it did go ahead and show that ambulatory, clinic, and the home BP were measured at baseline and after 28 days. They had a primary endpoint, was a change from baseline in 24-hour mean systolic blood pressure. They did show that there was an increase in their 24-hour mean systolic by 2.9 millimeters of mercury, a diastolic change. This was all versus placebo. What I thought was the most interesting part to this study was that they actually completed another assessment after the discontinuation of the treatment. And why I think that was important was it answers a good question. What happens when I remove that therapeutic agent? Do I see a reduction or a return in the blood pressure? In this case, based upon this therapeutic agent and the treatment plan, they were able to show that it was resolved after discontinuation of the therapeutic treatment, which I think is a good question when you start to take a look at short-term versus long-term exposure to therapeutic agents and its impact from a cardiac safety and specifically a blood pressure perspective. Similar case studies are available in the area of neuroscience as well as in other therapeutic indications, and I'm glad to share those with you in a follow-up communication, but just wanted to be cognizant of time today. So let's take a look then at some of the assessment modalities that we presently have and where we're seeing things go forward and how do they apply to the clinical trials environment? How do we integrate these? Are they the appropriate technologies, or what I like to say, building the best mousetrap to be able to, in fact, answer the question that needs to be addressed from a regulatory perspective, as well as from a scientific perspective. So again, just a quick shot for those that aren't as familiar maybe with the technologies, but technologies such as centralized automated office BP using a oscillometric device and being able to transmit that data digitally to a core lab or a central repository. And this is often referenced as, I reference it as a static time point. And you have discussions around the number of blood pressure readings that should be taken and the averaging of that kind of generated out of the SPRINT trial as to the best way to do clinic blood pressure. The idea here is that when we implement these automated oscillometric devices, say versus a standard auscultatory device, is that you do remove what is referenced often as the white coat response, where the individual sits quietly and the device takes the readings at a set sequence. You then move to the middle panel where you see the ambulatory blood pressure device. Again, this is a very valuable tool, both from the efficacy and safety perspective, as we've discussed. It does provide us a 24-hour profile of the individual's blood pressure, taking us from day to night. These can be set up to take predefined inflation sequences on an hourly basis. Again, a very powerful tool to be able to look at it. And then an area, again, with home blood pressure, not just with the individual taking their own readings and writing it in a paper diary of some way, but in fact, remotely capturing that, whether it be through a web application or through a cellular connection. And again, recognized by the scientific bodies, all three of these are complementary. So it's not to be seen as one or the other. It really has to do with the endpoint that you're trying to define in your trial, will then guide you as into the best solution and how they can complement each other based upon your phase of your clinical trial and whether or not there's a blood pressure signal. So I did want to share these images with you and then take you to the next step where we start to take a look at how are these applied. As we referenced before in the axitinib trial, this data was captured with the ABPM, and you can see how an individual would wear that for 24 hours. And you can see on the x-axis the time of day, the y-axis, the blood pressures that were captured. And again, the ability to take a look across that circadian rhythm, a very powerful tool depending upon what and how you need to define that blood pressure signal. Is there something associated with the pharmacokinetics of the drug, which we want to take a look from the time of exposure to X hours out? Do we see a change in the individual's blood pressure, and is it consistent? Then taking a look at the clinic assessment, this does allow you to, in fact, capture a set sequence of readings with a break, or if you want to say a rest period between readings. As I just previously mentioned, this became a very important discussion topic coming out of the SPRINT trial. Frequently, it used to be you just take one reading. Now you can take replicate readings Many scientific groups do have guidance, and there presently is a effort going underway to coordinate between the European Society of Hypertension and the American Heart Association, kind of the standardization of this process, and then how many readings should be taken and what should that average look like. So a very important component here, because we do know that clinic BP, often listed as a vital sign, really does have an important effect when we start to take a look at defining that blood pressure signal, again, if there is one that is seen from that Pressor effect guidance. The last one to share on the present slide deck is to show you what occurs with the home blood pressure. Again, capturing this data digitally allows us really to get what I call longitudinal data. So it's not static in the clinic, which is kind of a one and done. It's more than 24 hours. So you can see here over an extended period of time, months, you are able to get a sense of that blood pressure response based upon exposure to the therapeutic treatment, as well as being able to set up thresholds so that if a blood pressure does go above or below a value, the site can be notified that there is a change in that blood pressure, and then the site can do whatever the protocol specifies as to whether or not they need to bring the individual in. When we take a look at all of these technologies, one of the things that makes blood pressure key is that you do want to make sure that the device that's implemented for the study is appropriate for the population. So what we do in adults may not be appropriate in pediatrics. What you do in certain populations, such as if you're working on a cardiometabolic drug or a metabolic drug, and you're dealing with individuals with larger BMI, is that blood pressure device actually been tested and used in that study population? Because we do know there are a lot of factors that can affect blood pressure, and we try to reduce those factors as we go forward. So then what I thought we'd do is take a look going forward, because I think we're still in a good amount of time, and I do want to allow some time for discussion. And we take a look at the technology developments. So again, I'm giving you this snapshot of some panels, but I'm adding something new to the back end there. And this is a topic that everyone is very well aware of, whether you've discussed the Apple Watch, different modalities that are out there. The one that you're seeing here happens to be the Octia BP bracelet. And what makes this unique, again, we've introduced the ABPM and the home BP. I call these bracelets that or wearables in some cases that allow us really to get extensive amounts of data, more than what you get with just the home BP and more than what you get with the ABPM, but different. And that's why I often reference it as a hybrid, because somebody could wear a wearable device for months and it will capture a specific number of readings with limited interruption to the study participants' lifestyle and approach, usually updating or collecting the data in real time or near real time using an application. And the question there, this is a great tool. Two questions. How are the regulators going to interpret this data? How is it going to be adopted? Okay, this is still new. And so understanding how this would get applied into your clinical trial, as well as how do I analyze the data, because I am now getting, again, a lot of data points over an extended period of time, which is very valuable. But we have to determine together the best way to analyze that data and what does it mean when we're looking at a blood pressure signal. So it's extremely exciting. I can say that I'm excited and the team's excited about what this provides to us. The technology is very advanced in how it does assess the blood pressure, which is part of it, in that these devices do need to go through a approval process. And in many cases, these are new technologies. They don't fit exactly into the regulatory FDA, say 510K approval cycle. So it's very exciting to take a look at how this type of technology, whether it be by a wearable patch or by a bracelet or watch, can be integrated into the solution. And again, always ties into the concept of real world as well as decentralized data. So when we take a look at this data, you can see again with the ABPM, you can see that on the left-hand panel, that circadian rhythm, where we're getting a lot of readings around that 24-hour period, well defining that change. The middle panel showing us an extended period of time, usually capturing 3 readings in the morning and 3 readings at night. So you are getting about 6 readings a day at a specific time point. So doing a good job of it. But then when you get into the display coming from the wearable type technology, you're getting approximately 28 to, I'll say 28 readings a day over, again, a 24-hour period. So you have these cycles of 24-hour periods. So it's very exciting what you can get, but we do want to make sure that when identifying a technology, that it meets the rigors that are more than just whatever might be for the commercial or commercial marketplace, that it can meet the rigors and address the regulatory requirements for defining a blood pressure signal. So where does that take us? Well, it gets even more exciting when we look down the line. This is from the University of Texas at Austin. This discussion has been around for a while using nanotechnologies. It's again, just in an exploratory point, but we did want to show you where some of the thinking is going. This happens to be an electronic tattoo, which is a blood pressure sensor. So we continue to move forward. In some cases, some people might say it's kind of like getting into the matrix, where things are being applied, and there are other devices that are inserted that allow you to monitor a number of different vital signs. But again, the ability to capture data without it being too much of a challenge on the individual, but again, focusing on the understanding of how does it fit within the regulatory environment and the validation of that technology, and then how do we use that data actually to define the endpoint. And this is exciting and innovative. But we do need to approach it interactively, both from the regulatory environment, the biopharmaceutical environment, and we in the cardiac safety arena as well. So I did want to, I think that pretty much rounds me up. And again, I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Kleiman, but Dr. Kleiman, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add to the discussion. I have hemmed and hawed quite a bit, and I'm not sure if we have some questions coming up, but I did want to take a chance to let you jump in.
Thanks, Jeff. That's a very comprehensive overview of this topic in a very short period of time. And the only thing that I would add is that some of the new non-cuff-based blood pressure measurement technologies are clearly not quite ready for prime time yet, but they're getting close. And that's going to be absolutely fascinating to see how we can extend our ability to monitor blood pressure, not just in a doctor's office, which is very artificial, not just for a single day out of the patient's life, but longitudinally over a period of weeks or months with no discomfort and no effects on the ability to carry out normal activities for that day. So we will be talking more about that, I'm sure, in the next couple of months or a year or two as these technologies come out. And then we have the important thing, of course, is to see, are they accepted by the regulators for drug approval decisions?
Yep. Thank you for that. It is really interesting. I mean, there's discussions on the wearables, there are discussions on decentralized, there's new technologies, and it's moving very rapidly. And I think why I use the word interactively between the biopharmaceutical, the CROs, cardiac safety providers, it is imperative that we do our homework. And we talk about innovation, and innovation is exciting, but we have to make sure that we apply it correctly and make sure that it's the appropriate tool to address the specific need of the study. The other innovative point that I wanted to highlight, and we didn't get a chance to build it into this presentation, but within Clario, the scope when we look at therapeutic areas, right now we're talking cardiac safety, but our innovation internally is really linking those resources together from a developer's perspective. So we talk about cardio oncology. I go back to that as an example. So the innovation of bringing seems quite simple, but the oncology imaging expertise with the cardiac safety and cardiac imaging expertise to the other areas of expertise then becomes that innovative solution. But we didn't have enough time to kind of bring that comprehensive solution to you, but glad to discuss that at a future date. But I know that Lisa and team asked me to keep it at about 45 minutes, which I think I've done reasonable. And so I'll hand it back over to you, and if we can answer any questions, please let us know.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think we have time for a couple of questions. One I'd like to ask sort of in follow up to the regulatory components you were chatting about is, we see obviously blood pressures quite often in protocols, and usually they're done like in triplicate and whatnot. Are there any regulatory guidelines specific to these automated blood pressures, and whether it has to be in triplicate or whatnot to represent kind of the standard visit that we're used to seeing within an office?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it really starts to get into right now where it's really an open discussion. It's kind of like, three cardiologists come into a bar and you ask them how many blood pressure readings to take. But in fact, there is not a specific direction. There was a recent reference in that draft guidance to taking triplicate. But when we're looking at protocols that are coming in and some of the scientific papers, the American Heart Association and combined with the ACC gave somewhat of a position as to maybe taking more than 3 and averaging the last 2. So there is a position statement out by some of the scientific bodies about it, but there is no regulatory requirement. So when developing your protocol, you do want to specify what that is that you're planning on doing. Excuse me. In many cases, it may be take 4 and discard the first because you're concerned about the first one. Maybe the person's a little bit excited. But I think the key here, similar to what we've experienced in the ECG world, is that we can't take for granted that these are important diagnostic procedures and that setting up the environment correctly, whether it be picking the right size cuff, whether it be having the individual rest for 5 minutes beforehand, no different than making sure you prepare the chest correctly for an ECG. They're critical in that drug development process, but often kind of overlooked as standard. So hope that answered your question.
The real issue here is the variability in blood pressure measurements and the variability in blood pressure itself with time. So if any of you have had the experience of going to a doctor's office and having more than one person take your blood pressure, you probably relate to my experience that when 2 people take my blood pressure in the doctor's office, the 2 values are different. So that variability is, whether it's related to the measurement, the person doing the measurements, or the blood pressure itself is unclear, but the FDA is asking us to exclude a blood pressure increase with an upper confidence bound of 3 millimeters of mercury, which means a mean increase of about 2 millimeters of mercury. That is so small that the use of single measurements in the office is not going to have adequate power to be able to exclude that. So that becomes the issue. And that's why the FDA guidance, which is a guidance and not formal law, the guidance is to use ambulatory blood pressure measurements and possibly that very high quality office measurements with automated devices, without medical personnel in the room with the patient recumbent and resting, and with multiple repeat measurements are suggested as a potential alternative. So one can always use the standard single readings of blood pressure in the clinic to make internal decisions, but that will less and less be valuable for regulatory submissions.
Excellent insight. Well, thank you very much. If there are, I see if there's any other questions, you can email Jeff. His information is on the slide right here. And if you are moving on to the next session, you can find that link in the chat. But thank you everybody for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate your participation.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody.